The iron collar felt heavier than it had any right to, biting into Aria Frostglen's neck as she stumbled through the doorway of the weathered homestead. Her wrists bound before her and every muscle in her body coiled tight with the certainty that pain was coming. She had learned in her 20 years that humans saw orcs as beasts at best, targets at worst, and the man who had purchased her debt from the slavers would surely prove no different, no matter how quiet his voice had been when he told them to remove the chains from her ankles so she could walk properly. The house was small but sturdy, built from dark timber and river stone, with a hearth that radiated warmth into the single main room. Herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams, and through a doorway she could see a bedroom, neat and sparse. The windows were unbarred, which struck her as odd. Everything about this place felt odd, too calm, too clean, too much like a home and not enough like the prison she had braced herself for. Zander Quinn moved past her with unhurried steps, his tall frame lean beneath a worn linen shirt and work trousers, his brown hair tied back from a face that showed perhaps 30 years of living. He had scars, she noticed, thin white lines along his forearms that spoke of old fights or hard labor. His eyes were gray, the color of winter clouds, and they had not once looked at her with the hunger or hatred she had expected. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of 2 chairs flanking a small wooden table. His voice was low, almost gentle, and that terrified her more than shouting would have. Aria remained standing, her green-skinned hands still bound, her pointed ears flat against her skull. Her tusks, small but visible at the corners of her mouth, ached from how tightly she had been clenching her jaw. She wore the rags the slavers had given her, thin and insufficient against the autumn chill that seeped through every gap in fabric. Her dark hair, tangled and matted, hung past her shoulders in a mess she had not been permitted to tend. "I would rather stand," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. If he wanted to beat her for defiance, better to learn that now than to cling to false hope. Zander studied her for a moment, those gray eyes moving from the collar to the rope binding her wrists, then to her face. Something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his mouth that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. "Suit yourself," he said, and turned toward the hearth. She watched him, every instinct screaming at her to track his movements, to prepare for the moment he would strike. But he only knelt by the fire, adding wood to the flames, then filled a kettle from a water bucket and hung it on an iron hook above the heat. The domesticity of it made her dizzy. This was not how masters behaved. This was not what happened to orc slaves. "When did you last eat?" Zander asked without turning around. "Yesterday morning." The truth slipped out before she could think better of it. He nodded, still facing the fire. "I will make bread and stew once we have settled things. First, we drink tea." The word sounded absurd, impossible. Aria's legs trembled beneath her, exhaustion and confusion warring with the adrenaline that had kept her upright through 2 days of being marched across the countryside like livestock. She had been taken 3 weeks ago, ripped from her clan's hunting grounds by a human raiding party that had killed her brother and left her aunt bleeding in the dirt. The slavers had bought her in some nameless border town, and she had spent every moment since then waiting for the cruelty she knew would come. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Raw and desperate, Zander stood and turned to face her fully. "Why what? Why tea? Why any of this?" Her voice cracked and she hated herself for it. "You paid gold for me. You own me now. So why are you not?" She could not finish the sentence, could not voice the horrors she had imagined in the dark of the slave wagon. His face did something complicated, a flash of what might have been pain crossing those gray eyes before settling into a quiet firmness. I paid your debt because the alternative was watching you be sold to the mine overseers in the Western Hills, and I have seen what happens to people sent there. No one deserves that fate. As for the tea, I am making it because you look half dead on your feet, and sitting down to share a warm drink is what civilized people do when a stranger enters their home. I am not a stranger, Aria said bitterly. I am your property. You are a person in my house, Zander corrected, his tone still gentle but with an edge of steel beneath it. And the first thing we are going to establish is that I do not keep slaves. I bought your contract, yes, but only so I could burn it. Once you have rested and eaten, you are free to leave if you choose. Or you can stay and work for wages like any hired hand. The choice will be yours. The words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and so impossible that her knees buckled. She caught herself against the edge of the table, her bound hands clumsy, and stared at him as though he had begun speaking in tongues. "You are lying," she whispered. "I am not." He crossed the room to a shelf, pulled down a rolled parchment and brought it to the table. With careful movements, he unrolled it to reveal the debt contract, her name written in harsh, angular letters beside a sum that represented 3 years of labor. Before she could process what he intended, Zander picked up the parchment, walked to the hearth, and fed it into the flames. Aria watched the paper curl and blacken, smoke rising as her slavery turned to ash. Something inside her chest came undone, a knot she had not known she was carrying, and the tears came without permission or warning. They streaked down her cheeks, hot and shameful, and she could not stop them no matter how hard she tried to swallow the sobs building in her throat. "No," she choked out. "No, this is not, you cannot." Zander returned to her side and, moving slowly as though approaching a wounded animal, produced a small knife from his belt. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her bound wrists. She nodded mutely, unable to trust her voice, and he cut through the rope with 2 clean strokes. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, blood rushing back into her hands with a painful tingle. He did not touch her beyond what was necessary, did not let his fingers linger or stray, and when the rope fell away he stepped back to give her space. "The collar will take a lockpick," he said quietly. "I have tools in the barn. After tea I will remove it if you permit me to try." The kettle began to whistle, a cheerful sound utterly at odds with the devastation happening inside Aria's heart. Zander moved back to the hearth, wrapped a cloth around the handle, and poured steaming water into 2 clay cups. The scent of herbs filled the air, something soothing and faintly sweet. He carried both cups to the table and set one down in front of the empty chair. "Please," he said, settling into the other seat. "Sit with me." She could not hold herself up any longer. Aria sank into the chair, her whole body shaking, and wrapped her newly freed hands around the warm cup. The heat seeped into her palms, chasing away some of the cold that had lived in her bones since the raid. She stared down at the pale liquid, watching steam curl upward, and the tears would not stop coming. "I do not understand," she managed between broken breaths. "Why would you do this?" "You are human. We are enemies." Zander took a sip of his tea, wincing slightly at the heat, before answering. "We do not have to be. I have seen enough war, enough hate. It solves nothing and costs everything." He paused, his gaze distant for a moment. "I was a soldier once, in the border conflicts 5 years back. Fought orcs, killed orcs, watched my friends die to orc blades. I came home with scars and nightmares and a belief that violence only breeds more violence. When I built this homestead, I promised myself I would live differently. So I am your penance." The bitterness crept back into her voice, a shield against the vulnerability threatening to swallow her whole. "A good deed to balance your ledger. No." His answer was firm, immediate. You are a person who deserved help, and I was in a position to give it. Nothing more complicated than that. Aria raised the cup to her lips with trembling hands and drank. The tea was chamomile and honey, gentle and warm, the kind of thing her mother used to make on cold evenings before the wars had intensified and her clan had been driven deeper into the mountains. The memory hit her like a blade between the ribs, and the sob that had been building finally broke free. She wept into her tea, shoulders shaking, and Zander Quinn did not tell her to be quiet or to compose herself. He simply sat across from her, drinking his own tea, and waited for the storm to pass. When she could finally breathe again, when the tears had slowed to occasional hitches in her breath, Aria wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him properly for the first time. He was watching her with something that might have been concern, but there was no pity in his expression, no disgust at her display of weakness. "I am sorry," she said hoarsely. "Do not be. You have earned the right to weep. Orcs do not weep." "Everyone weeps," Zander said simply. "Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying or broken." She wanted to argue, to defend her people's strength, but exhaustion was pulling at her now that the immediate terror had faded. Her body felt impossibly heavy, every muscle screaming for rest. Zander seemed to notice because he stood and gestured toward the bedroom. "There is a bed in there, clean sheets, a blanket. You should sleep. We can talk more when you wake." "Where will you sleep?" Suspicion crept back in despite his kindness. She had learned that generosity often came with a price. "I have a bedroll. I will sleep by the fire tonight." He must have seen the doubt in her face because he added, "The door has a bolt on the inside. You can lock it if it makes you feel safer." Aria pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly. "The collar can wait until you have rested. You are safe here, Aria Frostglen. I swear it on whatever honor I have left." She wanted to believe him. Every instinct warned her not to, but the tea sat warm in her belly, and her wrists were free, and the debt contract was ash. Slowly, like a wild thing learning to trust, she walked to the bedroom door. The room beyond was as simple as the rest of the house, with a real bed covered in wool blankets and a window that looked out over fields going gold with autumn. It was more than she had seen in weeks. It was more than she had dared to hope for. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. "Rest well," Zander replied and returned to his tea. Aria closed the door, slid the bolt home with shaking fingers, and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. She was asleep before her head fully settled into the pillow, tumbling into darkness free of dreams or nightmares, her body finally convinced that it was allowed to stop running. She woke to the smell of bread baking and the low amber light of late afternoon slanting through the window. For a moment she could not remember where she was, panic spiking through her before memory returned in a rush. The slave wagon, the purchase, the tea, the burned contract, Zander Quinn, who made no sense at all. Aria sat up slowly, testing her body for injuries she had grown so accustomed to ignoring. Her muscles ached, her neck was raw beneath the collar, and hunger gnawed at her insides with insistent teeth. But she was rested, truly rested, for the first time in weeks. She stood and went to the door, hesitating with her hand on the bolt. What if it had all been a lie? What if she opened this door to find chains waiting or worse? But she could not hide in this room forever, and the smell of food was too tempting to resist. The bolt slid back with a soft click, and Aria stepped into the main room. Zander was at the hearth, ladling something from a pot into wooden bowls. He looked up when she entered and offered a small smile. "Good timing. The stew is ready, and the bread just finished." The table had been set with 2 places, 2 bowls, 2 spoons, 2 thick slices of bread steaming beside a crock of butter. It was so achingly domestic, so normal, that Aria felt her throat tighten again. "Sit," Zander said, carrying the bowls over. "Eat. Then we will deal with that collar." She sat, and he placed a bowl before her. The stew was thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, rich and hearty. Her hands shook as she picked up the spoon, and the first bite was so good she nearly wept again. She forced herself to eat slowly, despite her body's desperate hunger. Years of survival instincts warning her that eating too fast after deprivation would make her sick. Zander ate his own meal in silence, not watching her but not ignoring her either, simply sharing the space in a way that felt companionable rather than threatening. When she had scraped her bowl clean and devoured the bread, he stood and retrieved a small leather case from a shelf. "I am not an expert locksmith," he said, returning to the table and opening the case to reveal a collection of thin metal tools. "But I have opened stubborn locks before. May I try?" Aria tilted her head back, exposing her throat in a gesture that went against every survival instinct she possessed. "Yes." He moved behind her, and she felt his fingers gentle against the back of her neck, examining the lock mechanism. His touch was clinical, careful, and he narrated what he was doing in a low voice. "There is a pin mechanism here, 3 tumblers from the feel of it. Standard slaver make, meant to be difficult but not impossible. I am going to insert the tension wrench first, then work the pins. Tell me if I hurt you." The metal scraped softly, and Aria held herself perfectly still, barely breathing. She could feel his concentration, the care he took not to let the tools scratch her skin. Minutes passed in tense silence, and then she heard a soft click. "Got one," Zander murmured. More scraping, another click. 2. The third pin resisted longer, and Aria felt sweat starting to bead on her forehead despite the cool air. Then, finally, a third click and the collar sprang open. Zander caught it before it could fall, lifting it away from her neck with gentle hands. "There," he said, coming around to face her and setting the cursed thing on the table between them. "You are free of it." Aria raised shaking hands to her throat, feeling the raw skin, the absence of weight. Tears pricked her eyes again, and she blinked them back furiously. "I do not know how to repay this." "There is nothing to repay. I told you the choice is yours now. You can leave whenever you wish. But if you want to stay, I could use help with the farm. Winter is coming, and there is much work to be done before the first snow. I would pay you fair wages, provide room and board, and treat you as I would any hired hand. No more, no less." She stared at him, searching his face for any hint of deception. "Why would you trust an orc? My people have killed humans. I have killed humans. In war or in cold blood." He asked quietly, "In battle, defending my clan's territory from raiders. Then you did what you had to do to survive, same as I did. I do not hold that against you." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I trust you because you have had every opportunity to attack me since you arrived, and you have not. I trust you because I see in your eyes the same exhaustion I felt when I came home from the war. You are tired of fighting, same as me." He was right, and the truth of it settled into her bones. She was so tired. Tired of running, tired of fear, tired of violence. The idea of staying here, of working honest labor for honest pay, of having a place to sleep without fear, it was almost too much to hope for. "I will stay," Aria heard herself say. "For now, until I decide what comes next." Zander nodded and extended his hand across the table. "Then we have an agreement. Welcome to Quinn's homestead, Aria Frostglen." She looked at his hand for a long moment, then reached out and clasped it. His grip was firm but not crushing, and he shook once before releasing her. It was the first time a human had touched her without violence or restraint, and the significance of that simple gesture hit her harder than she expected. "There is a washroom behind the house," Zander said, standing to clear the dishes. "A pump and a tub, soap, towels. You are welcome to clean up if you like. I will find you some proper clothes. They will be too large, but better than rags." Aria nodded, unable to find words, and followed him outside as he showed her the small washroom built against the back of the house. It was simple but functional, with a large wooden tub and a pump that drew clear water from a deep well. He left her with a bar of soap that smelled of lavender and a pile of clean towels, then retreated to give her privacy. She stripped off the rags and stood naked in the cool autumn air for a moment, looking down at herself. Her green skin was marked with bruises in various stages of healing, dirt caked in every crease, her muscles lean from hard travel and little food. She looked like what she was, a survivor. Aria pumped water into the tub, cold and bracing, and began to scrub. The dirt came away in gray streams, and she washed her hair 3 times before it felt clean. Her tusks needed polishing, her nails needed trimming, but those could wait. For now, it was enough to feel clean, to wash away the touch of slavers and the grime of captivity. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel, she found a stack of clothes waiting on a bench by the door. A linen shirt, wool trousers, a leather belt, thick socks, and worn but sturdy boots. All too large, but she rolled the cuffs and cinched the belt tight, and found herself clothed like a person rather than property for the first time in weeks. She returned to the house to find Zander had prepared tea again, and they sat together at the table as the sun set outside the windows. He asked her about her clan carefully, and she found herself answering. She told him about the mountains where she had grown up, about learning to hunt with her brother, about the increasing human encroachment that had sparked the conflicts. He listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, and when she asked about his past, he told her about his life as a soldier, about the things he had seen and done that haunted him still. "I do not know if we can ever have real peace between our peoples," Zander said quietly as full dark settled outside. "There is too much history, too much blood. But I think we can have peace here in this house on this farm. I think that is a start." "It is more than I thought possible yesterday," Aria admitted. "Then let us see what tomorrow brings." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike in its normalcy. Zander woke with the dawn and began his chores, and Aria rose soon after to join him. He taught her the routines of the farm, feeding the chickens that clucked in their coop, tending the vegetable garden, repairing fences damaged by deer, splitting wood for the winter stores. The work was hard but honest, and her body remembered the rhythms of labor from her life before captivity. She was stronger than him, her orc heritage giving her an advantage in tasks that required raw power, and she took quiet pride in being able to lift loads that would have staggered him. Zander never made her feel inferior for her strength, never treated it as threatening or unnatural. He simply adjusted the division of labor to suit their different capabilities, and praised her work the same way he might praise anyone's. In the evenings they cooked together, simple meals of bread and stew and roasted vegetables from the garden. They talked, carefully at first and then with growing ease, about small things and large things and everything in between. Aria learned that Zander had inherited this land from his father, who had died while Zander was at war. He had come home to an empty house and spent the past 5 years building it into a working farm, alone by choice, because he found it easier than navigating the prejudices and complications of the nearby town. "They know I was a soldier," he explained one evening as they sat by the fire, the autumn wind howling outside. "They know I fought orcs and came home speaking of peace. That makes me a traitor in their eyes or a coward. Either way, I am not welcome at their tables." "I am sorry," Aria said and meant it. He shrugged. I prefer my own company anyway, or I did until now. Something shifted in the air between them at that admission, a charge that made Aria's pulse quicken. She looked at him across the firelight, at the way the flames cast shadows on his face, and realized with a start that she had grown comfortable here. More than comfortable. She looked forward to their conversations, to the quiet companionship of shared work, to the way he smiled when she made a dry joke about the chickens' attitudes. This was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. Humans and orcs did not form friendships, let alone anything deeper. Her clan would disown her if they knew she was living peacefully with a human man, and his town would run her out or kill her if they discovered her presence. There was no future in this, no matter how much she wished there could be. But as the weeks passed and autumn deepened into the edge of winter, Aria found it harder and harder to remember why she should leave. The farm was productive, the work was satisfying, and Zander Quinn was the kindest person she had ever known. He never raised his voice, never made her feel less than human despite her orcish blood, and treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. She caught him watching her sometimes, when he thought she was not looking. His gray eyes would follow her as she worked, expressions soft and wondering, and when she met his gaze he would look away quickly, a faint color rising in his cheeks. It made her feel things she had no business feeling, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the quiet man who had given her back her freedom. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that transformed the world into something clean and new. Aria stood in the doorway of the barn, watching fat flakes drift down, and felt Zander come to stand beside her. "Beautiful," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed, though she was not looking at the snow. He glanced at her and their eyes met. For a long moment neither of them moved, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Then Zander cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should bring the chickens into the barn," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It will get colder tonight." They worked in silence, moving the small flock into the shelter of the barn where they would be protected from the worst of the winter weather. When the task was done, Aria found she could not hold her tongue any longer. "Zander," she said, and he stopped, turning to face her. "Why do you look at me that way?" He froze, clearly understanding exactly what she meant. For a moment she thought he would deny it, would retreat behind polite deflection. But then he sighed, running a hand through his brown hair, and met her eyes squarely. "Because you are remarkable," he said simply. "Because you are strong and brave and kinder than you have any reason to be after what you have endured. Because when you smile, which is rare, it lights up the whole room. Because he stopped himself, shaking his head. "Because I am a fool who knows better than to feel what I feel." Aria's heart hammered against her ribs. "And what do you feel?" "Something impossible," Zander said quietly. "Something that can only end badly for both of us. So I am trying very hard not to feel it, but I am failing spectacularly." She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and before she could second-guess herself, reached up to cup his face in her hands. His skin was warm against her palms, rough with the start of evening stubble, and he stared at her with wide eyes. "I feel it too," she whispered. "And I do not know what to do about it." Zander's hands came up to cover hers, gentle but firm. "We do nothing. We cannot. Your people would cast you out and mine would kill you. There is no world in which this works, Aria. I know." The admission hurt more than any physical wound. But that does not make it less true. They stood there in the growing darkness of the barn, hands clasped, breathing each other's air. Then, slowly, Zander lowered her hands and stepped back, putting distance between them once more. "We should go inside," he said roughly. "It is getting cold." Aria nodded, not trusting her voice, and followed him back to the house. That night they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the space between them a chasm neither dared to cross. The acknowledgement of their feelings had changed something fundamental, and now every glance carried weight, every accidental touch sent sparks racing up her spine. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world blanketed in white. Zander was quieter than usual as they went about the chores, and Aria matched his silence, her thoughts churning. She knew she should leave. Staying was only going to make this harder, and there was no happy ending waiting for them down this road. But the thought of leaving made her chest ache, and she found excuse after excuse to delay one more day, she told herself. One more week. Just until the winter stores are fully prepared. Just until the first thaw. The lies piled up and she stayed. December arrived with bitter winds and heavy snowfall that made travel nearly impossible. They were snowed in for days at a time, and the forced proximity made everything worse and better all at once. Aria learned the way Zander took his tea, the small scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, the way he hummed tunelessly while cooking. He learned that she was ticklish behind her pointed ears, that she had a talent for carving wood, that she could speak 3 languages and read better than most humans. They played strategy games in the evenings, carved figures from scrap wood, told stories of their childhoods. They laughed together, worked together, existed together in a bubble of peace that felt stolen from another world. And through it all, the unspoken feelings grew stronger, an undercurrent to every interaction. It came to a head on a night when the wind screamed around the house and snow piled high against the windows. They had spent the day inside, maintaining tools and mending clothes, and the cabin felt especially small with the storm raging outside. Aria was sitting by the fire, polishing her tusks with a bit of soft cloth, when Zander spoke from across the room. "I cannot do this anymore," he said quietly. She looked up, her stomach dropping. "Do what? Pretend that I do not want to touch you every moment of every day. Pretend that I am content with friendship when I dream of so much more. Pretend that you are just a hired hand and not," he stopped, closing his eyes, "not the most important person in my world." Aria set down the cloth with shaking hands. "Zander, I know it is impossible," he continued, opening his eyes to look at her with such raw longing it stole her breath. "I know every reason why we cannot, but I am tired of hiding how I feel, tired of this distance between us. So I am telling you now plainly, I love you, Aria Frostglen. I love your strength and your courage and the way you look at the world. I love the sound of your laugh and the furrow between your brows when you concentrate. I love you, hopelessly and completely, and I needed you to know even if nothing can come of it." The words hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable and terrifying. Aria stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and crossed to where he sat. She sank to her knees in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking. "I have tried not to. I have told myself all the reasons it is foolish and dangerous and doomed. But I love you, Zander Quinn, and I do not know how to stop." He reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Then let us not stop. Let us be foolish together just for tonight. We can face tomorrow's consequences tomorrow." Aria leaned into his touch, turning her head to press a kiss to his palm. "Yes." He drew her up and kissed her, soft and careful as though she might break. But Aria was not breakable, and she deepened the kiss, pouring weeks of longing into the press of lips and tongue. Zander made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, and she went willingly, climbing into his lap as the kiss turned desperate. They made love there by the firelight, slow and tender, learning the geography of each other's bodies with reverent hands. Zander traced the scars on her back, kissed the calluses on her palms, whispered her name like a prayer. Aria mapped the planes of his chest, the dip of his spine, the places that made him gasp. They were gentle with each other, careful of differences and celebrating similarities, and when they finally came together, it felt like coming home. Afterward, they lay tangled in blankets on the floor, skin to skin, listening to the wind outside. Aria rested her head on Zander's chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath her ear. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. His arms tightened around her. "I do not know. But I know I do not want to lose you. Whatever it takes, whatever we have to face, I want to face it together. My clan will not accept this. If they found us, they would kill you and drag me back in chains. I would be an outcast at best. And the people in town would form a mob if they knew I was harboring an orc, let alone loving one. We would both hang." He paused, then added, "So we do not give them the chance. We stay here on this land and build our life away from both our peoples. It will be hard and lonely at times, but we would have each other. You would give up your people for me." Aria lifted her head to look at him. "I gave them up when I came home speaking of peace. You are not taking me from anything I still possess." His gray eyes were serious, certain. "But I would be asking you to do the same, and that is not a small thing. Your clan, your family, my brother is dead, my aunt is dead, and the rest of my clan chose survival over honor when they cast out those who showed mercy to humans. I have no people anymore, Zander. Or rather," she corrected herself, touching his face gently, "you are my people now." He turned his head to kiss her palm, eyes closing. "Then we make a new clan, just the two of us, and if that makes us outcasts, so be it." They slept there by the fire, wrapped in each other in blankets, and Aria woke feeling more at peace than she had in years. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world buried in snow and silence. Zander woke soon after, and they moved to the bed together, reluctant to leave the warmth of their embrace. The winter passed in a haze of work and stolen moments, every day bringing them closer together. They learned to navigate the physical side of their relationship, discovering that the differences between their bodies were smaller than the similarities. Aria learned that Zander was ticklish along his ribs, that he made the most wonderful sounds when she kissed his throat. Zander learned the places that made her shiver, the words that made her laugh, the exact pressure of touch that drove her wild. But it was not just physical. They grew together in every way that mattered, sharing their hopes and fears and dreams for a future they were not sure they could have. They talked about what their life might look like, staying on the farm, growing their own food, trading with distant towns where their relationship might raise fewer eyebrows. They talked about children someday, if such a thing was even possible between their species. They talked about everything and nothing, and the winter felt shorter than it should have because they filled it with love. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering well into March before finally releasing its grip. When the thaw finally arrived, it brought trouble with it. Aria was in the garden, turning over soil in preparation for planting when she heard the horses. Her head snapped up, every instinct screaming danger, and she dropped the spade to run toward the house. Zander appeared in the doorway, his face tight with concern, and together they watched as 4 riders crested the hill that marked the edge of Quinn property. They were human men, rough-looking and armed, with the kind of hard eyes that promised violence. Aria recognized the type: bounty hunters or slavers, men who made their living off the misery of others. They rode right up to the house with no sign of courtesy or caution, and the largest of them, a barrel-chested man with a scarred face, looked down at Zander with unconcealed contempt. "Quinn," he said, the name spoken like a curse. Heard you bought yourself an orc slave back in autumn. Where is she? Zander stepped forward, putting himself between Aria and the riders. I freed her. She is gone, headed north months ago. The scarred man's eyes moved past Zander to where Aria stood, taking in her green skin and tusks with a slow, nasty smile. That's so, because that looks like an orc to me, standing right there in your garden. She is a free woman, Zander said, his voice hard, and this is my land. You are not welcome here. Free woman, the man repeated mockingly. Orcs are not people, Quinn. They are animals. And this one is wanted for questioning regarding raids on human settlements. We have a writ from the territorial magistrate to collect her. He pulled a rolled parchment from his coat, waving it like a banner. Aria's blood ran cold. Wanted for questioning was a polite way of saying they planned to torture her for information she did not have, then hang her as an example. That writ is not valid here, Zander said firmly. This land is owned freehold, outside the magistrate's jurisdiction. You have no authority to take anyone from my property. We have the authority of steel, another rider said, patting the sword at his hip. Now stand aside, traitor, or we will go through you. Zander did not move. No. Time seemed to slow. Aria saw the riders exchange glances, saw hands move toward weapons. She calculated distances, angles, her own chances if she rushed them. 4 armed men on horseback against 1 unarmed human and 1 orc with a garden spade. The odds were terrible. But before anyone could move, Zander drew a long knife from his belt, the blade catching the spring sunlight. His stance shifted, settling into something that spoke of training and muscle memory, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold as winter. I said no. This is my land and she is under my protection. If you want her, you go through me, and I promise you I will not go down easy. The scarred man laughed, but it was a nervous sound. You would die for an orc. You really are mad, Quinn. I would die for her, Zander corrected. There is a difference. Aria felt her heart break and soar all at once. She moved to stand beside him, her hands empty but her body coiled to fight. If you want me, she said, her voice carrying across the yard, you will have to kill us both. And I promise you, at least 2 of you will not leave this farm alive. The riders shifted uneasily. They had expected an easy capture, a lone orc they could overwhelm and bind. They had not expected resistance, and certainly not from a human willing to die for her. The scarred man's eyes moved between Zander and Aria, calculating odds, weighing profit against risk. The bounty is not worth dying for, one of the other riders muttered. Shut up, the scarred man snapped. But his hand had moved away from his sword, and his horse was already turning, responding to some unconscious signal of retreat. This is not over, he said, pointing at them with 1 thick finger. The magistrate will hear of this, Quinn. You are harboring a fugitive, and that is treason. They will come for you both. Let them come, Zander said flatly. The answer will be the same. The riders left, kicking their horses into a trot that carried them back over the hill and out of sight. Aria waited until they were gone before letting her legs give out, sinking to her knees in the garden soil. Zander was beside her instantly, pulling her into his arms, and she buried her face against his chest. They will come back, she said, voice muffled by his shirt. With more men, maybe soldiers. You cannot fight an entire regiment, Zander. Then we leave, he said simply. We pack what we can carry, take the horses, and head for the borderlands. There are places where the magistrate's writ does not reach, settlements where people care more about survival than politics. We can start over. You love this place. Your father built this farm. I cannot ask you to abandon it. He tilted her face up, forcing her to meet his eyes. This place is wood and stone and dirt. You are my life now, Aria. Where you go, I go. Nothing else matters." She kissed him fiercely, tasting salt on his lips and not sure if it was from her tears or his. "Then we leave tonight as soon as it is dark." They spent the afternoon preparing, working with urgent efficiency. They packed food, blankets, tools, everything they could carry or load onto the 2 horses Zander kept. They buried anything of sentimental value in a cache behind the barn, hoping to retrieve it someday if circumstances changed. They moved through the house one last time as the sun set, memorizing the place that had been their sanctuary. "Ready?" Zander asked as full dark settled outside. Aria looked around the little house, at the table where they had shared so many meals, the fire where they had sat through so many evenings, the bed where they had held each other through winter nights. Then she looked at Zander, at the man who had given her freedom and love and a reason to hope, and nodded. "Ready." They rode out under cover of darkness, heading west toward the mountains and the wild lands beyond. The journey was hard, following game trails and avoiding roads, camping cold to prevent their fires from being seen. They traded the horses in a border town for supplies and continued on foot, moving deeper into territory where human law held no sway. After 2 weeks of hard travel, they found what they were looking for: a small valley tucked between 2 peaks, with a clear stream and good soil and forests full of game. No one lived here. No one claimed this land. It was wild and beautiful and far from anyone who might want to tear them apart. "Here," Aria said, standing in the center of the valley with the sun on her face. "We build here." Zander took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then we build." They spent that spring and summer constructing a new home, just the 2 of them against the wilderness. It was back-breaking work, felling trees and shaping logs, digging foundations and raising walls. But they were young and strong and motivated by love, and slowly a house took shape. It was smaller than Quinn's homestead had been, but it was theirs, built by their combined effort. They planted a garden, set snares for rabbits, fished the stream. They learned to live off the land, adapting and improvising. Aria taught Zander to read the forest signs, to track game and identify edible plants. Zander taught her carpentry and stonework, skills she had never needed in her clan but proved invaluable now. By autumn, they had a home, small but snug, with a fireplace that drew well and windows that looked out over their valley. They had a garden producing vegetables, a smokehouse for preserving meat, and enough stores to see them through the winter. They had built a life from nothing, just the 2 of them, and it was enough. On the first snow of their second winter in the valley, Zander carved a set of rings from mountain ash wood, simple bands polished smooth. He presented them to Aria one evening by the fire, his hands nervous. "I know we cannot have a legal marriage," he said quietly. "No human priest would bless us, and no orc shaman would acknowledge us. But I want you to know that I consider myself bound to you, now and forever. Will you wear this ring as a symbol of our commitment? Will you be my wife in every way that matters?" Aria took the ring with shaking hands, feeling the smooth wood warm against her palm. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They exchanged rings there by the firelight, speaking their own vows to each other with no witness but the walls they had built and the life they had made. When they kissed to seal their promises, Aria felt something settle deep in her soul, a certainty that this was right, that they had found something worth every sacrifice. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. They lived in their valley, mostly isolated but not entirely alone. They discovered other outcasts in the mountains: a halfling scholar fleeing religious persecution, a pair of elven deserters from some distant war, a human widow who had married an orc and been cast out by her village. They formed a loose community, helping each other through hard times, sharing news and goods, building something new in the spaces their old worlds had abandoned. Aria and Zander became respected in this community of misfits, known for their fairness and generosity. They hosted gatherings in their home, welcomed strangers who meant no harm, and defended their valley when threats appeared. They lived simply but richly, finding joy in small things. A successful harvest, a deer taken cleanly, the first flowers of spring. And when, 3 years after settling in the valley, Aria realized she was pregnant, they both wept with joy and terror. There was no certainty that an orc human child was even viable, no midwife with experience in such births, no precedent for what their baby might be. But they faced the uncertainty together, as they faced everything, and when their daughter was born healthy and howling in the depth of winter, they named her Hope. She had Zander's gray eyes and Aria's green skin, tiny tusks and a shock of dark hair. She was perfect and impossible, a living symbol of the love between two peoples who were supposed to be enemies. They raised her with stories of both her heritages, teaching her to be proud of what she was, to see the strength in her mixed blood rather than the shame others might assign. More children followed, a son with his father's coloring and his mother's strength, twin daughters who could pass for human or orc, depending on the light. Their house grew, expanded with new rooms to hold their growing family. The valley filled with the sounds of children laughing, playing, growing up free of the prejudices that had nearly destroyed their parents. On a spring evening many years after that first cup of tea, Aria sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains. Zander came out to join her, moving a bit slower now with gray threading through his brown hair, and settled into the chair beside hers. Their youngest daughter was practicing archery in the yard, her form nearly perfect, while their eldest son worked in the garden with his own wife, a human girl from the community who had fallen in love with his gentle nature. "You ever regret it?" Aria asked quietly. "Giving up your old life for this?" Zander reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "Not for a single moment. That was not a life. This is a life." She squeezed his fingers, feeling the wooden ring he still wore smooth against her palm. "I never thanked you properly, you know. For that first day. For the tea, for the freedom, for seeing me as a person when no one else did." "You have thanked me every day since," Zander said, raising their joined hands to kiss her knuckles. "By staying, by building this with me, by giving me a family I never thought I would have. You have given me everything, Aria." "We gave each other everything," she corrected, and leaned over to kiss him softly. Their daughter hit the target with a satisfying thunk and called out for them to watch her next shot. They applauded, called encouragement, and sat together in the fading light. Around them, their valley hummed with life, with the community they had built from rejection and love. It was not the future either of them had imagined in their youths, but it was better than anything they had dared to dream. Years later still, when Aria was old and silver-haired, when Zander's hands shook too much to carve anymore, when their grandchildren filled the valley with noise and joy, she would still remember that first day. The collar heavy on her neck, the expectation of cruelty, the shock of kindness. And the cup of tea, simple and warm, that had broken through her defenses, and shown her that another world was possible. She had braced for cruelty in his house, expecting nothing but pain. Instead she had found love and freedom, and a man who looked at her and saw not a monster but a woman worth saving, worth choosing, worth building a life beside. That cup of tea had changed everything, had been the first step on a journey that had carried them both far from the world they had known and into something infinitely better. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, decades after that autumn day, it was with Xander's hand in hers and the certainty that their love had been the greatest adventure of all. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story for generations after. Of the orc girl who expected death and found life, of the human man who chose love over hate, and of the family they built in a valley where two worlds had finally found peace. It became a legend in the mountains, a tale told around fires on cold nights, a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness could change the course of a life. And it all began with a cup of tea, offered by gentle hands to a frightened soul, in a small house on the edge of nowhere, where an impossible love took root and flourished against all odds. Aria and Xander's Valley eventually grew into a settlement known as Hope's Valley, named for their first daughter, and it stood as a testament to what was possible when two people chose each other, despite every reason to remain apart. The settlement welcomed all who came in peace, regardless of species or history, and became a beacon of tolerance in a world still struggling with old hatreds. Travelers would speak of the strange community in the mountains where orcs and humans lived side by side, married each other, raised children together, and proved that the barriers between peoples were not as insurmountable as they seemed. But the true story, the one that made Hope's Valley possible, was the quieter tale of a scarred soldier and a frightened prisoner, and the simple act of humanity that had saved them both.